Samuel Drauschak reveals the transformative power of process science in business and how structured process improvement methodologies can increase efficiency and profitability. But when faced with overwhelming changes, will you slow down or hire help?
Welcome to Biz Help For You, the show that saves you the expensive learning curve by providing advice from industry experts in every facet of the entrepreneurial journey. Too many small businesses collapse. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 20% fail within their first year, and less than 35% make it to their 10th anniversary. The goal of this podcast is to change that statistic. So if you're interested in learning more to be a successful entrepreneur, tune in today.
Now, let me tell you a little bit about my guest today. Sam Drawshack is the co-founder and chief process scientist at Truville, whose mission is to help businesses achieve maximum revenue growth through the principles of process science. He's the author of Becoming a Conscious Business, which details the insights he achieved by studying the efficiency in nature and evolution that determines the survival and growth of species. The Truville method applies these same principles to business systems to maximize energy flow, eliminate waste, and optimize productivity. So, Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am interested in what you have to say. This is something I haven't talked with anyone before. But before I get into questions I have for you on the topic, I'd love for you just to tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you became an entrepreneur.
Sure. So myself, I studied science in school, and then I ended up going into process improvement and process engineering quite by accident. I ended up just taking my science background and working in water treatment, actually, for a number of years. And then from there, I went back to study process and business more formally, and I went and consulted for a long time. And what really brought me to entrepreneurship was there was this whole new emerging need in consulting with this massive digitization in the early 2000s, and then coming into the last, basically, since the internet came out, we've had this massive push to digitize. And there wasn't a lot of process improvement methods that were really specific for digital services and on this new digital age of business. So I really just wanted to do my own thing and experiment and keep helping people in new ways. And I just felt very constrained in traditional consulting. So I just really fell into entrepreneurship by accident because I just didn't want to follow everyone's instructions. And maybe that's what every entrepreneur says, but I just was given a lot of instruction that just didn't apply. And I knew I could do better to help clients, and I knew I could be more creative. So I really just needed to go off on my own, originally just consulting, to get that to the market. And now eventually I've created a software company so I can hopefully bring my knowledge to a lot more people.
Perfect. Well, before we get into kind of the hows of process science and implementing it in business, I would love for you first to just give a definition of what that even means.
Sure. So process science, practically, you could say it's the evolution of process improvement. So if anyone's familiar with process management, process improvement methodologies, it's been around for a long time. Lean, Six Sigma, you probably heard these words thrown around in various contexts. Process science is really just the next stage of studying change in living systems, studying how energy moves through processes and creates value for businesses. And the biggest difference between process science and what comes before it is there is a rigor to how you do process science, how you structure the data, how you do your analyses, and how you report on your findings, so that, like in other forms of science, other people can look at your results and extract something meaningful from it. Because a lot of process work today is done by consultants. It's done by people where they have to recreate the wheel every time. And that's really what process science brings to the game, which is that you should be able to use the same process tools and the same process data and get similar process outcomes. So that's really what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. So I would love for you to just go a little deeper into really the primary objective of implementing this process science in organizational change management.
Great. The primary objective is to increase energy flow through business organisms or business organizations. And I know that can sound almost like new agey and abstract. But when we talk about energy in business, we're talking about labor and capital for the most part. And when we talk about how does labor and capital flow through processes faster with a higher velocity, because if you get more throughput, you create more value as a business, typically. Mm-hmm. So process science, the objective of actually infusing this into your business is having the right tools and the right methods so that you understand what your energy consumption is and your yield on value production, and you understand how you can reorient your operating model so you can produce more value at lower cost. So at the highest level, the objective is to just be more sustainable, be more adaptable, and create more profit and create more value for customers in your marketplace.
Well, and what you're saying sounds like, oh, great, right? All we have to do is make things a little more efficient and things are going to flow better. But that can be overwhelming too, because sometimes people don't even know where to start implementing. So do you have like a tip of even how to get started to make these changes?
Absolutely. The number one tip is just start writing it down. That's it. Write down what your process is in your company. Write down what you were doing. What are your operations? What are your projects? I think a lot of people, especially in now where everything is digitized and everything is a little more, I guess, less tangible, let me say, the idea is it's harder to apply your common sense to your business. So it is overwhelming. And like you said, everyone can say, hey, process improvement, it makes sense. Lower costs and increased throughput, right? Who wouldn't want that? But it can be challenging because what is a process? How do you articulate your processes? How do you actually capture process data and work with it properly? This is all in the domain of process science tools and methods. But ultimately, if you're starting from nothing, just start expressing yourself on paper. A lot of entrepreneurs, they think they know what their process is until they're challenged to write it down. So you don't even need any fancy tools to start. Even pen and paper is fine. No matter what you do, if you feel like you could do some process improvement, the first step is always, what am I doing today? And how do I articulate that into a process data set? And then you can go from there.
I think it's even important for someone who is a solopreneur right now too, to be able to write this down. So I'd love for you to touch on that too, because I'm sure some people are thinking, well, there's no one in my company that has to follow a process. So why should I take the time to write all of this down? But of course, my perspective is it's still important because at some point you're probably going to have some help.
I couldn't agree more. It's absolutely critical. So for solopreneurs, I almost have the same, your enthusiasm for, well, even if you're not delegating today, you've got to know what you're doing to keep track of what you're doing. A lot of times, mastery is what the solopreneur has. They have some master level skill set they're trying to bring to the market, but actually trying to articulate what that process is, it's helpful for a number of things. It's helpful for your own understanding, for being able to actually improve your process over time, to make sure that you're able to communicate to other people, whether it's vendors or new employees. So I think it's even more critical for solopreneurs to constantly be checking in, writing down their processes, making sure that they are able to articulate their skill set to other people, because otherwise you can't scale. It's very hard to grow from solopreneurship if you don't have the ability to communicate what you're doing.
And I think too, a lot of times people think, oh, it's just in my head and I just do it, right? And they may miss some steps. And so if someone else comes in at some point to do it, they might get stuck because, wait, it says to go from here to here, but there's something missing, right? So I think as you're doing it too is helpful to write it down. So maybe, I mean, I'm sure you have a lot more tips on this too, but I'm thinking from someone just hearing what you're saying is at least start by writing down everything you can think of, but then maybe double check it as you're doing it the next time to make sure you didn't miss something.
I think that's absolutely sound advice. You can write it down for yourself exactly how you would think is to write it down, and you're only going to have your own self-critique. So it might be pretty gentle, right? Oh, this makes sense. But honestly, a lot of people find when they even try to write it down, they're already extremely challenged to actually write down what they're doing, in what order, what systems they're using, how to do certain things. When this happens, do this. When that happens, do that. So like you said, if you start writing down in any basic form and then you check yourself against it as if you were trying to give this to a new person and would it suffice for them to do what you're doing, it's a very rewarding exercise. And I think, without trying to prove all the nuance in this conversation, just give it a try and I'm sure you'll see the value pretty quickly.
And how do you feel about like videoing your process too? Because I know a lot of people will say, well, I'm not so great at writing, but maybe I could video what I'm doing.
Sure. I think it's a great place to start. I would tell anyone who's willing to put process data in some form that can be shared with others, go with whatever is the path of least resistance. Like all forms of data, we have to start thinking about this process information as data, and video data is less structured than other forms of data. So, and the more you use a medium that has less structured data, the less utility it has in other applications, right? So I would say start there. And if you feel more comfortable sharing your processes over video with your staff or with other people outside the company, then go there. But you're going to find that if that's effective, you're going to always have to make more videos for different contexts, different customers, whatever it is. So it's kind of work your way towards more and more structured forms of process data, and that will help you scale your business eventually.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think about specific industries? Like, are there certain ones that this is easier to adopt this process science and make these changes, or do you think it really can be done across the board?
I do think it can be done across the board, but I will say it's going to be the ease or the complexity of how you use process work is going to be a function of how tactile your business still is. And what I mean by that is how much can you still use your entire senses to actually see the business? Because I will say that the industries that are struggling the most are now fully digitized service industries typically. If you're a marketing agency or you're a marketing company, legal services, financial services, where a lot of it now is completely digitized, there's nothing to look at anymore. So you have to be very diligent in how you capture and extract and then articulate that process data. If you work in a factory, it's still like it could be, 50 years ago, where if you go in and you just walk through and you use your eyes, your hands, you can actually see what the process is live. So process science can be applied everywhere, but it is a little bit more of a muscle you have to build when you can't see it anymore. You can't use the senses that you're used to engaging with.
Well, and if leadership in a company is saying, this is important, we want to have continuous improvement and we want to document our processes. But of course, there are sometimes people there that are like, why do we need to make the change? It works just fine, right? So how can you get people on board in your company to be willing to continue to make these changes and have this continuous improvement?
Yeah, so that's a big one. So you're talking now about how do I do change management, project management, the whole thing. And I think it's important to acknowledge, because if you're going to use process science correctly or any sort of business improvement methodology correctly, it's always going to come to this question that you just asked, which is how do we get people on board? How do we do appropriate change management and actually make the changes possible, make them a reality and realize the benefits? And I would say it's a pretty complicated answer, but generally what I find works best, just as a rule of thumb, because like even in the question you're saying, well, how do we get these people to come on board? Get them to initiate the change is usually the way that it makes it work the best. So when I say that, it's don't conceive of the change and then push it down onto your staff and say, here's what you're going to do and here's why. What we really should be cultivating, and this is what effective process systems do, it's we should give goals to people who are on the line or on the floor to point out process improvement that they think would make their job easier or make their lives easier or make their jobs more pleasant or more productive, and have them champion their own changes. Because then you're not trying to overcome this massive change resistance and explain to people who don't care or have no visibility as to why they're doing something, but really cultivate this autonomous desire to make their lives improved. And that's true continuous improvement. Because if you can do that, then the changes are coming from the people who need to change, and then it's a lot less challenging.
Well, what if you have the opposite, where somebody is, coming up with these ideas to make these changes all the time, but maybe it's really not the best way to move forward for the company? So how do you keep them excited about wanting to come up with ideas and make change, yet let them know, like, maybe in this instance, we're not going to do this particular thing this way?
Yeah, it's another great question. And my short answer is process transparency is this idea that you should always be able to expose as much information about your operating model to everyone who asks as possible. So if you have junior employees who they only can see a certain part of the company, but they feel empowered to make suggestions or make changes, but they might not be appropriate holistically, given like a broader context that you can see, the answer I would give is you teach them why, and you have that conversation, and you be completely open and transparent about this idea is not as appropriate as you think because of X, Y, and Z things that you don't see. And actually, that's a great trigger in companies who are very adaptive to say, we need to provide that to employees. They should have that vision. They shouldn't be in a position where they see so little of their operation that they can provide suggestions that might inadvertently suboptimize a smaller group. At the expense of the whole. So in that case, you should always be combating that at a management level to say, how can I give my employees the largest view of the company and the value proposition of the company as possible, so that when they make decisions, those decisions are informed and they're informed for the whole.
hmm And what about like a timeline for coming up with these changes? I mean, I'm sure depending on what it is, some things may be relatively quick and some things may take a long period of time. But what do you think is like a typical timeline that we should have so that people are comfortable and they're feeling where they can properly do this new thing without making a bunch of mistakes or, having issues? How do we implement it where we're not rushing it, but it's not taking longer than it needs to?
Sure. Well, this is where process science is really interesting because it gives a lot of frameworks and underlying strategies to manage what you're talking about, which is there's always in a given situation, there's quick wins and there's long-term strategic plays, and that will be no matter what. So it's not even to me a question about, well, how do we keep people focused if they're changing? Do we do short? Do we do long? Because you always have the option to do all of those things. I think it really comes down to looking at where you are today and staying present. So process science really suggests that we stay present with our current processes and our circumstances and look at what is the most ROI producing changes we can make today. And sometimes those will suggest going short and quick and really getting a few things done. Or sometimes they'll suggest, hey, we're in a stable place. There's not a lot of market disruption coming. Let's really focus on some of these strategic long-term wins and really invest in new capability. So I don't know if there's a one size fits all answer to that question, but I do certainly think with the right kind of structure and methodology, you should always feel empowered to be weighing and prioritizing what opportunities you have in front of you versus just reacting in the moment.
Right. Well, and as you were saying that, I'm thinking someone might be wondering, well, how do I actually determine what's going to bring the best ROI? I know there's some things I need to improve, but I'm not sure what the first thing is that I should focus on because maybe there's these three things I think that I can do. How do I know what to pick? Right.
Yeah. And that I think is really just, again, just having this idea of a business case. And I keep coming back to this idea that process science is sort of a loaded tool set in the sense that it goes through the entire life cycle of how do I change a process. But to change any process requires a project typically. And any good project starts with a project charter or some sort of business use case with structured data. So when you talk about, well, how do I know what's more ROI than another thing? How do we measure that? And it might differ from company to company in some ways. But ultimately, it's always going to be some version of what are the list of known problems we have in our operating model right now today? And if we were to solve those problems in a meaningful way and actually yield results from solving those problems, what would that yield look like? Is it X amount of revenue, less customer complaints, more sales? Like, what is the metric? And then trying to normalize all of those outcomes against, some sort of universal indicator like profit. And then once you do that, you just create a prioritization schema. But a lot of times it's just, I'm rattling these things off, but it's just having this scientific approach of, well, there's infinite things to do. What are the problems? What are the results? And what are some of the estimated costs of getting from problem to result? And then how do those results line up? And then all of a sudden you say, I have a pretty common sense return on investment model. It's just about doing the research before you act. And a lot of times we don't have that luxury. So we have to know the methods. We have to know the foundations so that we can go into these conversations feeling empowered to navigate them and not having so much guesswork.
Well, and I was also thinking while you were talking, if someone is thinking like, great, like I know I need to make some changes, but number one, I'm not sure how to actually implement all these changes too, or number two, I'm just so overwhelmed trying to keep up with everything that I'm doing that it's hard for me to have enough time to actually help get this going in the company. So what would you say to someone who's kind of in that situation?
Yeah, it's a great situation. I know a lot of us are in it, especially entrepreneurs who, if you were comfortable at 40 hours and then all of a sudden you're at 60 hours and then all of a sudden you're working 100 hours and now you can't do anything because you can't even, you're just focusing all of your energy and even energy you don't have trying to keep the lights on. So that's a common scenario. And what do you do with that? There's only a few things you can do with that ultimately, and they're all going to sound catastrophic. So don't be too freaked out, but you've got to either slow down and start losing some of the sales or losing some of the house of cards that you've set up just propped on your own unsustainable labor and let things settle. Or you're going to have to hire help. And even if you have to hire help, you're going to have to plan for some business disruption while you really focus on training that help appropriately so that you can scale a bit. But there's really no easy solution. I mean, you cannot be working 100-hour weeks and expect to sustain that pace of business. So if you're going to reduce the hours so you have capacity to think about process improvement, You have to plan on a dip in your business or some business disruption until you can fortify your model. And then we can talk about a million ways to fortify your business model, but there's not like a cheat that you can do except making the time for process improvement. But like everything, process improvement, if you make the time for it, it should amplify whatever you are trying to do. And then when you come back to your business model that's stronger, you should have more capacity and more throughput. And that's the whole point.
So are there any tools or technologies that you recommend to really help with this process science and, making these changes more efficiently?
Yeah, so there's a ton of tools that I would recommend, but they all have to be supported by a strong methodology. Because if you don't have the method and you don't have the know-how, and again, there's three main domains that I always encourage people to know if they're going to make meaningful change in their business. And one is process science or some sort of process management methodology, just understanding process. And the second is project management, and the third is change management. Now, there's some overlap there, but those three are what you need to actually make changes happen effectively in your business. And as far as understanding the methods, they're system agnostic. Now to the question you asked about what are the tools that I use to execute those three effectively, project management has its own host of best practice systems. So if you look up, that's a hot market right now. You've got Monday, you've got Asana, you've got ClickUp. I mean, you name it. There's a ton of systems that are focused on project management. And then on the process side, it gets a little bit more muddy. So if you're doing good process work, there's a lot of whiteboarding tools out there, and there's a lot of blank, canvases for you to start doing process mapping or process analysis. But to be honest with you, there's not a lot of guidance or best practice tools in the space right now, just to do process work. At our company, Truville, we're trying to build some tools to translate some of that process science knowledge into software that you can use. But today, it's kind of, you've got to have the knowledge and you've got to find the tool that works for you. And then on the change management side, there's structured tools out there, but that's mostly a soft skill discipline still.
Okay. So obviously you want to have processes for people to follow, especially if it's something very detailed and you say step 1, step 2, step 3. But how do you balance that with also having some type of flexibility or adaptability during these times of change?
Yeah. So a lot of people have this conception, and it's baked into your question, that process equals standard and stifled creativity and everyone just acting like robots. And that can be some types of process work if you have very detailed SOPs or standing operating procedures and you're being audited and what have you. But I would say generally in the service arena, having a structured process still gives a lot of room for creativity. Having a good process outline for your business is really more about here are the activities being done by which people and which systems, and here are the objectives of those processes, and giving people enough flexibility just in the way the process is structured so that they can try to use the standard things, the standard tools and the standard roles in the company to keep improving the result. You do not want to have, it's not even really possible if you're thinking about process as a click-by-click procedure to even map that for your entire company. You'd go crazy. And by the time you were done doing it one time, the business would have already moved on, several iterations. It's really about finding out where most of your people are spending their time. It's the energy flow thing. It's where's most of my labor and capital going, and use the 80-20 rule. And once you kind of have that down, try to get it so it's not so fuzzy. But then after that, let all your people or let yourself run wild with it. You can change the systems. You can change the objectives. You can do what you want, but you can't change anything in a lab if you don't know what the lab is. You can't do anything to a process if you don't know what the base is. So you've got to get it down at some detail level, but don't expect it to be a stifling experience. If you're really feeling like, if writing a process is so tedious and it means that I have to do it to the letter, that's not the kind of process work we're talking about.
Right. So obviously we understand it's important to be able to make these changes and have continuous improvement, but at the same time, there would be some type of pitfalls to be aware of. So can you touch on what those might be?
For sure. I do think it's complicated work. So it's one of the things we're trying to combat by making things more simple for people so they can follow it. But today, doing process management is tough. There's a lot of different systems. There's a lot of different options. It takes a lot of skill and it takes a lot of time to do. So I'd say one of the biggest pitfalls is trying to do process improvement and expecting a big result without expecting the practice, the learning curve. Because you can waste a lot of time in process work, but just like any other type of project. I mean, how many people listening have tried to put in a system and had a really hard time with it and had to roll it back or not gotten the result? Or how many people have tried to hire a bunch of new staff to help solve a problem and it just created more mess? Anytime you're trying to change your business, you put yourself at risk of losing more money and making it even worse if you're not doing it right. So I'd say that's no different in terms of pitfalls with process work. You have to go into it with the right kind of respect, which is this is a domain I have to learn. I can start very simply, but don't expect to get 100% conversion on your project work initially. Give yourself some gentleness and time to learn and push. Because if you have a few bad projects, the worst thing you can do is think this isn't for me and this isn't for my business, and then go back to running it just sort of crazy, willy-nilly, guess and check mode. It's something you got to work at and you got to invest in. And that's the pitfall, just not realizing the situation.
Right. I mean, things do take time. It's not like we can snap our fingers and we're all following it perfectly, right? We have to learn. So I think having a little bit of grace is probably important.
Yeah. Well, and especially, how many times now with the systems, everyone wants the magic bullet. They think if I buy this system or I buy that system, I'm going to just plug it in my business and boom, more leads, more sales, more revenue, whatever it is. But those are all projects. It's tough. So like you said, giving yourself some grace, giving yourself some time to know, I got to build these process muscles if I really want to do this more effectively over time. And you got to invest in it.
Right. Well, I know we're coming short on time. We're getting close to the end. So I want to ask, is there like any other takeaway you want to share, something I didn't know to ask on this topic?
No, I think you covered it at a really great level. We had a rapid fire here type of conversation, which I thought was fantastic. The one thing I'd say is, I told everyone, get into just writing down your processes, but process mapping is the more formal term that we didn't really discuss directly. But process mapping, there's a few languages out there. Truville, my company, is building their own language, but I would definitely invest in making process mapping a part of your life and your business, no matter what you do. So beyond just writing something down informally, talk about process mapping, talk to your staff about process mapping, get everyone in the culture of articulating their processes, because even if you just start to see your company in process terms, it's going to change the way you perceive business. I guarantee it.
Great. Well, this has been an interesting discussion. Like I said, I know we are coming short on time. So I would love to ask if you have an offer that you would like to extend to our listeners, and how can they connect with you if they have additional questions?
Sure. So let's start with connecting with me. My name, Sam Drawshack. If it's not listed, it'll probably be listed in the show notes, I assume. So you can look me up. I'm the only Sam Drawshack out there on the internet. You can find me on LinkedIn under my name. You can also feel free to email me directly at sam@truville.com, Truvle. And as far as offers, we are about to launch our first product at Truville, so you're catching us right at launch time. And I don't have a formal offer for you, but if you're an early adopter and you want to join our early tribe, just reach out and let's have a personal conversation, because I'm happy to offer you a discount if that's what it takes for you to try the product and join our group. So with that, I don't have anything structured, but please reach out. And if you're interested in process mapping or process science tools, we can definitely work out some sort of promotion.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Sam, for being a guest and talking about process science. I think that's a term I hadn't heard before. And so that's why I thought it was going to be interesting to have this conversation. Of course, I've heard about change and, continuous improvement and things like that too. But I thought it was a great conversation and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, listeners, for tuning in today. I hope you found this topic interesting and enjoyed the informative discussion. Would you please share my show with those you know and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform? I'd really appreciate your support. If you have any additional questions or comments, be sure to reach out to my guest at any of the links that they shared, or you could send me a message at media@ABandP.com. I hope you can join me for my next interview, and remember, you can connect with me on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and my website is ABandP.com. This episode is sponsored by Affordable Bookkeeping and Payroll Services. If you are overwhelmed trying to handle the financial aspects of your business, ABandP is here to help. Contact us today to discuss your needs at 310-534-5577 or contact@abandp.com. My team and I are eager to assist you. Until next time, have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Biz Help For You. Please join your host, Candy Messer, again next time. Have a terrific day.